Almost 30 years after the Balkan Wars and over half a century after Soviet troops marched into Prague and Budapest, war has returned to Europe.
The scenes unfolding in the streets and fields of Ukraine are nothing short of a tragedy. Brave young soldiers and innocent civilians are being cut down. Tanks are rumbling through towns and cities, missiles raining indiscriminately from the skies.
On August 20th, 1968, the Soviet Union, along with Poland, Bulgaria, and Hungary, invaded Czechoslovakia, with 500,000 soldiers, thousands of tanks, and hundreds of airplanes to violently crush an effort by the Czech government to enact new liberal reforms. To the revolutionary constituents that made up the Communist Chinese Party headed by Mao Zedong, this action was seen as a monstrous crime, validating a long-standing distrust of their communist Soviet counterparts. However, Mao did not sympathize with the Czech reformists. His resentments lied in the belief that the Soviet Union and the United States were in collusion to divide the world between themselves, seeing the Soviet Union not as a communist ally, but as a fascist imperialist no better than the evil capitalists in charge of the West. 54 years later, the unthinkable has happened in Ukraine. Russia, under the guise of a special military operation, has launched a full-scale invasion that has already become the largest European conflict since the 1940s. Overnight, Europe has revamped its entire post-Cold War relationship with Russia. Millions of Ukrainians flee for their lives to the advancing armies in indiscriminate bombing of civilian targets. Massive sanctions have been placed on the Russian economy, causing the ruble to be officially worth less than toilet paper. NATO and its allies' airspaces have been closed to 80 Russian aircraft, and even historically neutral countries like Sweden and Switzerland have taken decisive action against Putin. Typically pacifist countries like Germany have foregone their 80-year-long policy of not sending military equipment to nations, and shortly after announced a colossal $100 billion increase to their military expenditure. Just this month, the US alone has spent $10 billion to bolster NATO's Eastern Front as its attentions turn once again to Europe. Russia, and more specifically Putin, is now more isolated than he has ever been before. Increasingly stringent Russian domestic policies, a crackdown on anti-war protests, and the full engagement of Putin's propaganda machine has caused Russia to become a pariah state, more akin to Iran and North Korea. The world has undoubtedly entered a new era of geopolitics that will have far-reaching consequences well beyond Eastern Europe. Largely speaking, the democracies of the world have presented a united front in condemning and taking action against Russia's blatant disregard for other countries' sovereignty and human rights. But that begs the question, what does the second largest economy and prospective future superpower China think about the latest invasion of an Eastern European country? And has that changed the geopolitical calculus in which the Chinese Communist Party functions? February 28th is a date forever stained into the history of Taiwan. On that day in 1947, an anti-government protest was ruthlessly suppressed, resulting in tens of thousands of deaths and ushering in a 40-year-long martial rule known as the White Terror. The government, headed by the KMT party, hunted down dissidents and ruled the island with an iron fist. Today, Taiwan is a thriving and rich democracy. But on the 75th anniversary of the massacre, the people of Taiwan waved the Ukrainian flag and projected its colors defiantly into the night sky from its towering skyscrapers. As one Japanese newspaper put it, the Russian invasion of Ukraine is not a fire on the opposite shore, and the people of Taiwan know this better than anyone. Ukraine and Taiwan might seem as different and as far away as two countries could get, but their situations are remarkably similar. Both countries used to be incorporated in large continental and multi-ethnic empires. Ukraine, a part of the former Russian then Soviet Empire, and Taiwan, a part of the Qing dynasty. The remnants of both empires are seeking to reclaim their former prestige and defensive capabilities by taking back their lost territories. Today, the KMT is not a threat to Taiwan anymore. The Communist Chinese Party, which sits just 100 miles from its shore, does. Russian actions in Ukraine and the international response could hold the fate of Taiwan's 23 million residents. The link between Ukraine and Taiwan is fundamentally related to the relationship between China and Russia, which has been tumultuous over the last 100 years. While Chinese leaders harshly denounced Soviet actions in Czechoslovakia in 1968, they have been hesitant to do so in Ukraine today. In the 1950s, they were geopolitical communist allies. However, the divergence between Stalinism and Maoism ultimately undermined their joint partnership. In the last 20 years, the two countries have once again become aligned in their fight against American global dominance. When backed into a corner, you don't really have a choice in who you make friends with. On paper, this alliance makes sense though. China is a manufacturing powerhouse, but lacks raw resources, and so it needs Russian energy. Russia has nearly abundant natural resources, but needs capital investment in order to broaden its economic base. It also yields advanced weapon systems China needs to modernize its military. It's plausible that Putin felt he could weather Western economic sanctions with the help of China. This would then make Russia more reliant on China, allowing it to yield more political power. But Russia fundamentally is a dying great power. Its economy is comparable to the US state of Florida. It's been in demographic decline for decades and is overrun with corruption. China, on the other hand, is an up-and-coming economic superpower that is much more integrated with global markets and has much more to lose. Aggressive Russian action, therefore, may prove to be a hindrance in how China wants the world to see itself. Nevertheless, Russian-Chinese relations are at their highest level since the 1950s. Just a month ago, as the 2022 Winter Olympics were kicking off in Beijing, Putin and Chinese President Xi Jinping met, signing 15 declarations of partnership and consolidating their solidarity against the West and NATO. Putin stated after the meeting that the Chinese-Russian relationship knows no bounds, but that is currently being put to the test. According to official reports, the United States actively shared information with the Chinese, pleading to help them stop a Russian invasion. Instead of helping, Chinese state media depicted Washington's claims as baseless propaganda, going as far as to share the intelligence with Russia, undermining the efforts. More recent intelligence released by the White House shows that President Xi might have even asked Putin to wait on his invasion until after the Olympics were over. This could explain why the day of the invasion, China opened up wheat imports from Russia, which would be crucial to bolster its allies' economy in the event of an economic war. While it's not currently clear just how much China knew of Russia's plans, it's clear by rhetoric and action that China is currently trying to walk a thin tightrope between supporting its Russian ally while also appearing on the global stage as a neutral entity and moderator for peace. China is trying to have its cake and eat it too. If you were to ask experts in the field of geopolitics just 2 months ago whether they thought a full-scale invasion of Ukraine or a Chinese invasion of Taiwan was more likely, most would have said Taiwan. Even as Russian troops started to mount on the Ukrainian border, the positioning, organization of battle regiments, and cost-benefit analysis suggested that Russia was putting on a show rather than actually getting ready for action. Nevertheless, Russia did invade, and for China, this is the mother of all scenarios in which it can study the response of the West and NATO. Possibly to Putin's surprise, NATO has largely remained united in its efforts to strangle the Russian economy and target the Russian oligarchs' financial assets abroad. The most dramatic of these actions are what China is paying attention to. Following the invasion, the West has waged a full-scale economic war against Russia. The freezing of assets of the Russian central bank will be, and already has been, catastrophic for the Russian domestic currency, the ruble. Russia, since 2014, has been attempting to build a fortress economy by dumping its reserves of US dollars and increasing its stockpiles of Chinese yuan and gold. Even after all these attempts, 65% of the stockpile of money is subject to Western freezing. In simple terms, the Russian government may have effectively lost 65% of all its money overnight. This severely weakens Russia's ability to fight inflation, and as a result, the ruble has lost 30% of its value in only a week, and the government may soon default. Russia is also still heavily reliant on imports. In some high-tech industries, such as chip-making and computers, Russia remains entirely dependent on American parts. 30% of Russian imports are paid for in the US dollar. The sudden lack thereof will make it increasingly difficult to buy goods, even with China, where 60% of transactions are based on the US currency. The West has also partnered partially cut off Russia from SWIFT, the global financial messaging system. Doing so is essentially throwing sand into the gears of the Russian financial system. Targeted sanctions on high-level officials and the powerful Russian oligarchs who own a majority of Russian industries is striking panic among those that Putin needs most to retain power. All of this must be extraordinarily alarming for the leaders of China, whose power largely remains intact through a continuance of economic prosperity. But what we have just witnessed firsthand is that the threat of significant sanctions do not provide a formidable enough defense to deter a powerful country from invading another. In the month leading up to the conflict, the White House repeatedly stated that it would invoke these sanctions should an invasion occur, but that did not stop Putin. In fact, historically, sanctions have not worked at preventing war. Just look to Italy, Germany, and Japan in the Second World War. But China is also seeing how the West responds militarily to Russia. While titanic shipments of military equipment have been pouring into Ukraine, the United States and its European allies have stood firm in their decision to not intervene in the war themselves. While the war has so far gone horribly for Russia, there is still a general consensus that Russia will succeed in toppling the Ukrainian government due to its sheer military advantage. Does China then think that the West will not intervene in the annexation of Taiwan? To understand that question, we need to look at the fundamental differences between Ukraine and Taiwan. Unlike Ukraine, Taiwan is crucial to global trade, as 30% of all shipping passes through the Strait of Taiwan. It also is integral in worldwide supply lines, as the country is dominant in the production of semiconductors. Taiwan is America's 9th largest trading partner, in comparison to 67th for Ukraine. And while the world is focused on Russia, China remains Washington's enemy number one. Russia appears to be in the death throes of a post-empire decline, whereas China will continue to gain power and influence for the next century. While more interconnected to global markets, it also yields a much more productive industrial base than Russia that has been and will become more self-sufficient. In summary, the stakes in Taiwan are much greater than in Ukraine for the West. And China's relationship with Russia is already starting to show signs of straining. You can see this in the evolution in the words that officials are using to describe the situation. The day before the war, a Chinese spokeswoman stated, "When the US drove 5 waves of NATO expansionism eastward, all the way to the Russians' doorstep and deployed advanced offensive strategic weapons in breach of its assurances to Russia, did it ever think about the consequences of pushing a big country to the wall?" China has failed to label the conflict an invasion and has repeated that Russia's geopolitical defense interests should be taken into consideration. It has also blamed the US for, quote, "starting the fire and fanning the flames." But China has not outwardly supported Russia and has continued to urge for peace. It has voted to abstain in a UN resolution condemning Russia's actions and reiterated that the sovereignty of nations is critical, and that includes Ukraine. As the war has evolved and Russia's military actions have been largely failing, and as the world has seemed to unite against Russia, China's rhetoric has shifted. Just a few days ago, China has signaled that it's ready to play a role in finding a ceasefire, stating that it deplored the outbreak of conflict in its strongest comment on the invasion so far. And this makes sense. China's global ambitions could start to come under fire if it's seen as being complicit in Russia's actions. Its Belt and Road Initiative, a gargantuan infrastructure undertaking to make it the new epicenter for global trade, has already been battered by bad press, the pandemic, and the fears of an impending domestic financial collapse. One of the main arteries for trade involves crisscrossing the Eurasian continent, with new railways known as the Iron Silk Road. Half of these pass through Russia, which now look likely to be compromised for the foreseeable future. And this fundamentally strikes at the core of the Chinese leadership, who have become heavily reliant on economic prosperity to secure their claim to power. The future is impossible to predict, and the events currently happening are constantly changing the probabilities for what might lie ahead. The following will rely on speculation. What we do know is that the Chinese, like the Russians, have been boxed in and put into a corner by the democracies of the world. They both have aspirations of gaining power and putting an end to American dominance. Along with their economies and resources which complement each other, they have been drawn closer together. Russia's actions have triggered an unprecedented united resistance to it. Crippling sanctions aimed at the average Russian as well as the elites have put Putin's hold on power in jeopardy. While sanctions have not historically or even currently been able to avoid war, in China it could be different, as they are currently benefiting from the status quo as they implement their global economic ambitions. The situation has already complicated this, and China appears to be pivoting to distance themselves from Moscow a little. China still wants Taiwan, and it's integral to its own aspirations, but it and the West have more to lose from that conflict. In my opinion, this has largely not changed China's geopolitical calculus. It may seek to shore up its economy further before starting any wars, but the targeted approach the West has enacted must be alarming to the Communist Party, which relies on the economy and elites to stay in power. For now, we should however keep our focus on those that are suffering and will in the future. As the Kikyu people in Kenya say, when the elephants fight, it's the grass that suffers. Long live democracy in Taiwan, and Slava Ukraini.